7, so should we start? I think there are people in the room now. So let me first of all introduce myself. I'm Roshan Dadu from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Gauteng and also on the South African BDS Coalition Committee. So welcome to everyone that's joined this Cape Town PSC meeting that's under the auspices of Israel Apartheid Week. And this year, the international theme of Israel Apartheid Week is United Against Racism. So this is a very pertinent discussion that we're going to have tonight. Just to mention, the SABDS coalition, of which PSC is a member, is the Palestine Solidarity Organization in South Africa, which is affiliated to the Palestinian BDS National Committee. The BNC represents the Palestinian civil society groups that originally issued the call for an international movement to isolate apartheid Israel in very much the same way that we in South Africa called for international solidarity and, of course, isolation of apartheid South Africa. And in that regard, I think it's important to mention that we adhere as the coalition and members of the coalition, and we take to heart the BNC anti-racist and anti-discriminatory principles, one of which states, adhering to the UN definition of racial discrimination, the BDS movement does not tolerate any act or discourse which adopts or promotes, among others, anti-Black racism, anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, xenophobia, or homophobia. The subject of discussion tonight, how can the left deal with accusations of anti-Semitism, of course arises in the context that we find particularly very recently in the last few years, of the pro-Israeli lobby taking the anti-Semitism so-called working definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Center to claim that any criticism of Israel amounts to anti-Semitism, and then using this claim to silence Palestinian solidarity activists around the globe. And of course, as Andrew will elaborate further, most perniciously these allegations have been used to expel left anti-racist campaigners from the Labour Party in the UK, including many prominent Black and Jewish Labour Party members. And of course, the suspension of the whip now on former Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, who I knew back in the day in the anti-apartheid movement in England. And I can definitely say is a lifelong anti-apartheid campaigner, an internationalist and a supporter of the just struggle of the Palestinian people for equal rights and justice without any hesitation or doubt. Of course, here in South Africa, I'm sure everyone is aware that there was an attempt by the South African Jewish Report to denounce us, the coalition, as anti-Semitic. But this was found to hold no purchase by the press ombuds. We put a complaint to the ombuds in this regard. When the Jewish Report tried to appeal, they were told by an independent judge chairing the appeals panel that they had no grounds, and they must abide by the original decision of the ombud to apologize to us. And we are waiting for them to do so. And Hassan is going to talk much more about that, I'm sure. So just maybe to briefly introduce the three panelists, although you can't see one of them, I'll explain in a minute, and in the order that we'll be hearing from them. I mean, I think it's a really excellent panel, and I certainly think we're going to learn a lot from each other's experiences, and it's a great opportunity to share how we've dealt with such false allegations of anti-Semitism that are clearly designed to silence us, and to see going forward how we can maybe more effectively deal with this sort of false allegation. So first of all, we're really delighted to have Andrew Feinstein, former ANC MP, who resigned in 2001 in protest at the ANC's refusal to countenance an independent inquiry into the arms deal. He's currently Executive Director of Shadow World Investigations, which is an NGO that details and exposes the impact of bribery and corruption, mainly focused on the global arms trade. He's also the son of a Holocaust survivor and an anti-racist activist, campaigning amongst many other issues for the rights of the Palestinian people. And also we are proud of him in South Africa for having introduced the first ever motion on Holocaust remembrance in the history of the South African Parliament. The next speaker we'll go to will be Haider Id, Associate Professor of Al-Aqsa University in Gaza. I'm sure many of us also know Haider because he spent a long while in South Africa. Unfortunately, he's had to send his contribution recorded on video because, as we know, Gaza has extreme electricity issues, all kinds of service provision issues, even worse than us and way worse than our current South African load shedding. So hopefully we won't load shed, but we'll hear from Haider through the recording. Unfortunately, that means we can't engage directly with him, but it's very important to hear from a Palestinian voice, someone who's been involved both in Palestine, in Gaza as he is now, but also in South Africa and other countries around this particular topic. And then finally, but not lastly, we'll hear from Hassan Logat, who again, I'm sure many of us know, is a long-time South African activist against apartheid here and now also in Palestine, amongst many, many other campaigns. I'm sure he can also mention some of the other issues that he's worked on. He's also been at the forefront of taking the complaint against the Jewish report. So he's very up to date on the very current ways in which we've been trying to challenge these false allegations here in South Africa. So without more further ado, I think let's hand over to Andrew and we'll kick off. Sorry, I should just say, sorry, Andrew, please put questions in the chat, not in the chat, in the Q&A. And if you're watching live on Facebook, I think we'll be trying to check there as well if any questions come there, because we do want to try to maximize the time we have. Andrew has to leave just after 8:30 our time. So we want to try and maximize the time for questions and contributions from everyone that's here. Thanks. Go ahead, Andrew, sorry.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much to the organizers of this event, both for organizing it and also for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and I feel honored and privileged to speak on the platform with such great panelists, and in terms of the organizing committee and the panelists, with a group of really wonderful comrades. So thank you very much. I certainly don't need to remind this audience that it was our first democratic president, Nelson Mandela, who said, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people." It is something that many people outside of South Africa and Palestine are often shocked by, because the image that is presented of Nelson Mandela is pretty much the very kindly, cuddly grandfather who endorsed all of the mainstream policies of most of the so-called Western world. And that included an often, at best, ambivalent relationship to the struggle of the Palestinian people. So I think it's a very important place to start. The second place I want to start is by mentioning just a little bit more about my personal background. And I'd like to apologize for this up front, because I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing to bring one's own personal identity necessarily into political debate and discussion. But there are occasions on which it has particular relevance. So I would just like to add that in addition to being the son of a survivor, it's worth mentioning that my mother actually lost 39 members of her family in the concentration camps of Theresienstadt and especially Auschwitz. And it was an extraordinary thing for me as I was preparing to introduce the first ever motion on the Holocaust in the South African Parliament to be able to talk with my mother about her and her family's experience. I started that motion with a letter she received from her grandfather, my great-grandfather, as he was about to be taken by train from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, where he knew he was going to be murdered. I also want to mention that I have written on and lectured on, including at Auschwitz for the Auschwitz Institute, the issue of genocide prevention, and specifically on how to use information from the global arms trade to attempt to preempt and prevent genocide around the world. I say that because there are many people in the UK, in the US, and in other parts of the world, I'm sure there are some in South Africa too, who suggest that if one is supportive of the Palestinian people and their struggle, one is somehow less Jewish or a different type of Jew. And the phrase, Hassan and I were talking just before we went live, the phrase self-hating Jew has become a very common one. Now, to avoid serving in the apartheid military, I studied endlessly. And amongst various degrees that I landed up collecting over the years, 3 of them are in clinical psychology. So to hear people glibly talking in these sort of pop psychology terms about self-hating this and self-hating that, because people express certain progressive political views, particularly rankles with me. And I think it's extremely important that we understand why this sort of language is used. And it's effectively being used because there is an attempt by the Israeli state at the moment, in my opinion, to effectively erase solidarity with the Palestinian people and their struggle. And I think part of what we as campaigners and activists need to do is to ensure that that attempted erasure fails miserably. Now, I also want to state up front, which you'll be glad to hear is not anything to do with my personal identity, is that for reasons that might be obvious to many of you, I'm also an unequivocal supporter of the BDS movement against Israel. And that's for 2 obvious reasons. As someone who got involved in the struggle against apartheid from my late teens, I am incredibly well aware of how important the BDS movement globally was in bringing an end to apartheid in South Africa. To the extent that I would argue that if it was not for the pressure brought to bear on certain of the key banks who were sustaining the apartheid era debt of the South African state, the apartheid state in South Africa would not have ended. The second reason that I unequivocally support BDS against Israel is because of the Israeli government's intensified intransigence. And when I say intensified, I think that it's now been a period of at least a decade and a half to 2 decades when we have seen a particular form of intransigence developing in Israel. And in some ways that came home to me as I watched the occupation of the American capital on the 6th of January, where you had some people who were actually sporting T-shirts with anti-Semitic slogans on them while holding up Israeli flags, which I think reflects the political and intellectual dissonance of quite a lot of what is going on in the world at the moment, because Israel has, in my opinion, become part of a global white nationalist project. And other members of that same project are actually anti-Semitic, but their anti-Semitism does not stop their relationship with the Israeli state. Now, I have visited Israel on a number of occasions, first as a child when my parents would take me there, and secondly, as a researcher and investigator into the global arms trade. And in these later years, while I've been there, I've obviously also spent time in the occupied territories. And one of those trips into the occupied territories was organized by an Israeli group called Breaking the Silence, a group of IDF soldiers who refused to obey orders in the occupied territories and who suffered a variety of consequences for that, including dishonorable dismissal from the IDF, etc. And there are 2 things that struck me on that particular trip, which was with a group of about 25 South African human rights activists, walking down Yehuda Street, what had been the main market street in Hebron, I was struck by a number of things. First of all, the extraordinary reality that on the street, that for a number of years before this moment, had been open only to members of the Israeli Defense Force and to Jewish settlers of a nearby settlement that is protected by the IDF and that was home to a murderer called Baruch Goldstein, who gunned down almost 30 Palestinians in cold blood many years ago. The graffiti on Yehuda Street was of the following: death to the Arabs, Arabs to the gas chambers. Now, it could only have been written by members of the IDF or people from the nearby settlement. And as the son of a Holocaust survivor, as an anti-racist, it is one of the most repulsive manifestations of racism that I've ever seen. And I think the way in which the Israeli state has been moving, as I said, for at least a decade and a half to 2 decades, it is sadly unsurprising that this sort of extreme racism is witnessed so openly. The other observation from that and other visits is that, of course, there are similarities and differences between apartheid in South Africa and what Israel is doing to the occupied territories, to Palestine. But there is one thing that struck me unequivocally, and that is Israel's form of racist apartheid is far more efficient than anything the egregious South African apartheid state came up with. To see the checkpoints where Palestinians are treated by teenaged Israeli soldiers as little more than animals, completely dehumanized. To see separate streets for Israeli Jews and for Palestinians, cars with completely different types of number plates on them, gave me some sense of how deep and how disturbing Israel's racist apartheid is. I, like any anti-racist around the world, am extremely concerned with rising levels globally of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all racism. But to many people, and I've experienced this profoundly in the United Kingdom where I live, it appears as though there is some sort of hierarchy of racism, and that certain types of racism are worse than certain other types. Now, to Palestinians in the occupied territories and in the diaspora, to Muslims in the United Kingdom and many parts of Europe, to people of color in the United States of America, not just under Donald Trump, but before and after Trump's odious presidency. These are people who experience racism systemically on a daily basis, and directly and personally. But according to Britain's Labour Party, the main opposition party in this country, anti-Semitism is far more important than any other form of racism. The reality is, though, the Labour Party cares very little about anti-Semitism or other forms of racism, very sadly. Anti-Semitism has simply been used by a right-wing leadership of the Labour Party that is currently in place in the form of my own constituency member of parliament, Sir Keir Starmer, as a stick with which to beat the left of the party, and particularly as a weapon to end the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. It was mentioned in the introduction to this event that Jeremy is a lifelong anti-racist and an anti-Semite. I've known him since I moved to the UK. He has worked a great deal on anti-war issues, so we come across each other a huge amount. We live a 10-minute walk from each other. It's fair to say that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't have a racist bone in his body. He is as much an anti-Semite as Nelson Mandela was a racist. But we have seen calculated, strategic political action taken very effectively against Jeremy Corbyn and less effectively against Bernie Sanders in the US when he was running for the presidential nomination. And this is simply a weapon that has worked, certainly in the UK, not in the US, to remove threats to the establishment and threats specifically to the Israeli state in its current guise. The irony of the situation in the United Kingdom is that the majority of individuals suspended under Keir Starmer's leadership for anti-Semitism and related offenses are anti-racist Jews. I had the extraordinary experience when I mentioned my own family background on Twitter as a reason for my support for Jeremy Corbyn. Two rabbis, one in the UK and one in the United States of America, responded on Twitter saying, "Your mother must have been one of those Jews who collaborated with the Nazis." That receives no response from the Labour Party leadership or from anybody in the British establishment, to the extent that I personally, although a member of the Labour Party, no longer feel welcome in the party. And the hypocrisy of this party is illustrated primarily by the reality that a member of parliament here, who was the first and loudest to describe Jeremy Corbyn in her own words as an effing racist and anti-Semite, was a woman by the name of Margaret Hodge, whose own family business, an iron and steel agency, made tens of millions of pounds out of working as an agent for the apartheid South African state. Hundreds of letters of complaint have been sent about Margaret Hodge to the Labour Party leadership. No one has received a reply. Absolutely no action has been taken. But the reality of this weaponization, of this abuse of anti-Semitism, is not only, obviously, that it is a very important tool in the armory of those trying to erase the Palestinian struggle from our daily reality. It is a tool in the armory of those who will defend the state of Israel regardless of what it does. And it has additional consequences. It undermines the very real struggle against actual racism, against actual anti-Semitism. Because while people like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders are being accused of anti-Semitism because they will not support Israel's every action, because they will support the struggle of the Palestinian people, actual anti-Semites like Donald Trump and Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who is regularly welcomed in Israel with full state honors. People like those who rioted in the capital in early January get away with their racism, get away with their anti-Semitism, get away with their Islamophobia, get away with their anti-Black racism and their misogyny. Not one of the people who are accusing progressives of racism and anti-Semitism have ever spoken up about Islamophobia or anti-Black racism. Because for them, there is only one form of racism. So finally, in the minute and a half that I have left, I ask the question, what should we as anti-racist campaigners and activists do? The first and most important thing is not to be silenced. I have found quite intentionally that as I have been trolled on social media by people who believe that Jeremy Corbyn is the devil incarnate, I have spoken more about the racism of Israeli apartheid. I have spoken more about the oppression of Palestinians and the importance of the global BDS movement. And I think this is crucial to our response, is to in no ways be silenced, to speak up against all racism in whatever form it is found by whomsoever it is perpetrated. We have a responsibility to speak louder about Israel, about the occupation of Palestine. And then when you live in a country like the United Kingdom, it is also crucial. And in fact, in South Africa, this is also incredibly important, to speak up against others of our appalling allies who commit constant human rights abuses, who are, as we speak, murdering children in the Yemen conflict with weapons made in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and elsewhere. And that is Saudi Arabia, close allies of Britain, and I'm afraid to say, of South Africa and its arms industry. We as activists and campaigners need to speak up about the suffering caused by Israel, caused by the form of neoliberal capitalism we have around the world today, and to ensure that we will not be cowed by the forces of reaction globally. Let me very quickly conclude with the words of a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, a remarkable woman, Irina Klepfus, whose father died very early on in the resistance in the ghetto, who says, "I have concluded that one way to pay tribute to those we loved, who struggled, resisted, and died, is to hold on to their fierce outrage at the destruction of the ordinary life of their people. It is this outrage we must use to fuel our actions and vision whenever we see signs of the disruptions of common life, the hysteria of a mother grieving for the teenager who's been shot, a family stunned in front of a vandalized or demolished home, a family separated, displaced, arbitrary and unjust laws that demand the closing and opening of shops and schools, humiliation of a people whose culture is alien and deemed inferior, a people left homeless without citizenship, a people living under military rule. Because of our experience, we recognize these evils as obstacles to peace. At these moments of recognition, we remember the past, feel the outrage that inspired the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, and allow it to guide us in present struggles." Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I think that was an amazing presentation that covered really a lot of key issues, and you know, your passion and your conviction in the face of all of the trolling and hysteria that you've had to face is really amazing. And we're glad that you do have time to, after we've heard from the other two panelists, take some questions. I know I've got a few questions already, but moving swiftly on, we're going to move on to Haider. Just to say that we did try to edit slightly just because it was a bit long, Haider's video, but we will put the full video up when we post up the recording on our YouTube and so on.
Hi. Of course, let me start by thanking the organizers of this important event. In particular, of course, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign of Cape Town and the South African BDS Coalition. And I want to start directly by addressing some of the questions raised in this panel. Because it's so sensitive. I know how sensitive this is in South Africa and in the West, in the West in particular, in fact. But let me start by giving my own experience as a Palestinian living in the Gaza Strip, but also as a BDS activist and a human rights activist as well. In August 2018, the UK Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, apologized, if you remember, for, and I'm quoting him, for the concern and anxiety he caused by hosting an event in Parliament on Holocaust Memorial Day in 2010. And it was titled, that event was titled, Never Again for Anyone, Auschwitz to Gaza. The event mentioned, in fact, was organized by by our comrades in the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, SPSC, and the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, IJAN. And it aimed to encourage people to learn from the atrocities of the past and attract attention to Israel's ongoing crimes against the Palestinian people in general and Gazans in particular. We know that, ever since Jeremy Corbyn caused a huge upset in the UK establishment by unexpectedly becoming the leader of the opposition, he has, since then, he has faced, until today, several accusations of anti-Semitism. And those accusations have largely been based on his active involvement in the pro-Palestinian movement. In August 2018, following a report by the Times newspaper, his participation in the 2010 event that I referred to was swiftly added to the long list of his alleged anti-Semitic acts. And at that time, the comparisons that were made there between some actions of Nazi Germany and the State of Israel were the bone of the problem, or rather the bone of contention. I am referring to this incident in particular because I was also present, or because my name was also mentioned in relation to these horrendous, baseless accusations. Auschwitz survivor, the late comrade Hayo Meyer, and I were invited by our comrades and SPSC and IJAN for a speaking tour in the UK and Ireland, which also included the Memorial Day event at the Parliament in the UK. At the time, I had to tell them that I could not attend because of the medieval siege imposed on Gaza by apartheid Israel. Then the tour's representatives asked me to send a pre-recorded speech about the situation in Gaza instead. When I started thinking about what to say in my message, the first thing that popped into my mind was my parents, who were refugees. Because this is where my story starts, because I also inherited my refugee status from my parents. Like the majority of the 2 million inhabitants of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, which has been turned into an open air prison, a concentration camp. My parents were from the village of Zarnuga, which once stood near what used to be the Palestinian city of Ramla. And in 1948, Israeli militias ethnically cleansed the area, expelling tens of thousands of Palestinians, including my parents. Unfortunately, they both died in the Nusayrat refugee camp where I was born. They both died in 2005. I could not attend their funeral and give them a proper farewell because I was living abroad at the time, 2005, and Israeli troops controlled all the crossings, the entrances and exits to Gaza. So a year after my parents' death, that is in 2006, the lives of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in Palestine became harder. That year, January 2006, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank were asked to choose their representatives in the Legislative Council, as you remember. The results of the election were catastrophic for Israel, for the United States of America, for reactionary Arab regimes, and for the Palestinian Authority, because people had voted against the Oslo Accords and against the two-state solution industry, the racist two-state solution. And in response to those results, in response to people's choice, Israel imposed a deadly siege on Palestine, which has been described by my friend and comrade Ilhan Omar, for example, an Israeli historian, as a form of incremental genocide. Now, the fact that I'm using, incremental genocide might be considered anti-Semitic, because according to Zionist propaganda, in the 20th century, there was only one genocide. And I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about. But anyway, that imposed, that medieval siege was not enough for apartheid Israel. Because in December 2008, Israel launched a new war against Gaza. And in just 22 days, more than 1,400 Palestinians, with the overwhelming majority of them being civilians, among them, of course, scores of children, were killed. Thousands more were forced to live in tents as their homes were destroyed by the Israeli bombardment. Of course, you know very well that Israel's attacks on us continued at full pace in the following years. It waged 2 more deadly wars on the people of Gaza in 2012 and in 2014, and killed, thousands, more civilians. And of course, you remember the Great March of Return, which aimed to implement United Nations Resolution 194, which calls for the return of Palestinian refugees. And during the events of the Great March of Return, Israel also killed more civilians, including children and women. So all this was on my mind when I was preparing my message for the gathering at the House of Commons back in 2010. The event itself was supposed to address, lessons learned from past atrocities. But I also have to mention that I'm also a naturalized South African. Because I spent 5 to 7 years in South Africa, starting from 1997 only 3 years after the first non-racial elections, which ultimately led to the appointment of Nelson Mandela as the first Black president of the country. And I have learned a lot from South Africa. And it's a struggle against one of the most inhumane regimes in history. A regime that is like Israel, like apartheid Israel, and Nazi Germany, is based on racial and ethnic exclusivity. I believe there are many parallels between the racist states of today and the yesteryear, whether Nazi Germany or apartheid South Africa or apartheid Israel. And I believe we Palestinians have a lot to learn from past struggles for freedom, integrity, dignity, equality, and liberation, and justice. I believe to make sure past atrocities are not repeated, we need to remember them, learn from them, and examine the reasons that allowed them to happen, because they are still happening in Palestine. This, in the end, was, my message. This was my message to the gathering at the House of Commons in 2010 on Holocaust Memorial Day. In this context, I made comparisons between the actions of Nazi Germany and in Israel. But I was criticizing Israel, not Judaism or Jews. That is the point that we need to remember. We need to reiterate all the time. I was also quoting from Israeli military and political leaders to prove my point. And let's be absolutely clear about it. I abhor all forms of racism and bigotry. In fact, I am one of the authors of a statement issued by a group of Palestinian writers and activists condemning racism and anti-Semitism around 2010. And in which that statement, in that statement, we called on supporters of Palestinian struggle not to provide any platform for the dissemination of anti-Semitic and racist statements. We see anti-Semitic language as, and I remember very well, as immoral and completely outside the core foundations of humanism, equality, and justice. Exactly like the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Our struggle is one on which the struggle for Palestine and its national movement rests. That struggle is based on moral grounds, humane grounds. Our struggle is with Zionism, not Judaism or Jews. Now, these points are extremely important if we want to address the issues of anti-Semitism. And we also added, I remember, in that statement that there is no room in our struggle for any attacks on our Jewish allies or on Jews or on Judaism, nor denying the Holocaust, nor allying in any possible way or shape or form with any conspiracy theories, far-right, orientalist, and racist arguments, associations, and entities. And this has to be the gist of this panel today. Challenging Zionism, including the illegitimate power of including its illegitimate powers of institutions that support the oppression of Palestinians, and the illegitimate use of Jewish identities to protect and legitimize oppression must never become an attack on Jewish identities, nor the demeaning and denial of Jewish histories in all their diversity. That was our statement, which represents mainstream Palestinian politics and civil society. In 2010, when the Times and BBC mentioned my name in relation to the outrageous allegations made against Mr. Corbyn, they did not give me the opportunity to explain where I stand. They never contacted me to ask about my opinion. Neither the Times nor the BBC or any other mainstream British media organization, alluded to our statement, the statement that I have just mentioned. British media reports also did not mention the comparisons between Nazi Germany and Israel's policies made by Israeli generals and state officials in the past. And that is, let me address directly now the question that you are raising, or some of the questions you are raising in your panel. Let me be honest with you. When in 2018, I heard of Jeremy Corbyn's, apology, that he was apologizing. Initially, I thought he apologized for not doing enough to rectify the horrific, terrible crimes committed by, Labour Party leaders, the likes of Tony Blair, for example, the invasion of Iraq, etc., which Jeremy Corbyn is opposed to. But then when I read his, defensive piece in The Guardian addressing the anti-Semitism accusations directed at his party, I was a bit disappointed. And I started getting worried, actually, because he was on the defensive. I was worried that while trying to placate the pro-Israel lobby in the UK, he might have risked at the time alienating those people who brought him to the leadership of the Labour Party. People who wanted their party to stand up to any form of racism, including anti-Palestinian racism, including Islamophobia, including Orientalism and anti-Semitism. One is supposed, in principle, to be opposed to all forms of racism, oppression, and discrimination. At the time, I chose not to rush and write a piece and give interviews about this, about the story. After immediately after the news broke about Corbyn's apology, because I did not want it to be considered a response, and I didn't want to be on the defensive. Neither does the Palestinian National Movement want to be on the defensive. Neither does the Palestinian civil society. I do understand the extent to which the pro-Israel lobby would go in order, and they said it, to bring Jeremy Corbyn down. And how hard it must be for someone like Mr. Corbyn, who spent a lifetime fighting racism, to find himself facing these kinds of accusations. But what you are doing right now in South Africa, and I'm glad Hassan Lorgat is with me here, representing the BD, the South African BDS coalition, that, your response is different. And your work, the PSC, the Palestine Solidarity campaigns across the country, the SABDS coalition, your work is so impressive because, in practice, you are answering the questions you are raising, because simply you stand your ground and refuse to be on the defensive all the time. And that is not what Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party did, unfortunately, and they lost the battle at the time, temporarily. We are calling for the establishment of a secular democratic state for all of its citizens, exactly like what you did in South Africa in 1994, when you went to the polling station and voted against apartheid. Not a single person could accuse you of being anti-white at the time. That is the point. The point is never to be on the defensive, stand your ground, and make it absolutely clear that what you are fighting for is justice. Justice for all. And I think this is what I would call, weakness point of those accusations of, anti-Semitism, etc., etc. We have to stand our ground. I have more to say, but I think it is more than enough. And I thank you again. And Amandla.
Well, thank you to Haider in his absence. I think, again, he's made a very powerful and clear statement. And, we can hear from him that the Palestinian movement, the national authority and civil society do not want to be on the defensive, and they do not want us in the solidarity movement to be on the defensive. I think there's an awful lot that Andrew can also come back on that Haider raised, particularly, I didn't know before that he had been sort of implicated in the anti-Semitism story of Jeremy Corbyn. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, particularly, of course, his feeling that perhaps there was too much of an apologetic attitude around these accusations, and that escalated the situation, which ended up in the dismissal of so many people from the party and Corbyn from the whip. But before we get into that, Haider obviously also mentioned Hassan, who's our next speaker. So I think let's hear from him, and then we can hopefully have a very good discussion afterwards. Hassan, go ahead.
Thanks, Roshan. Being the last speaker, I've got to quote one Marx at least, Groucho Marx, when he said about principles, if you don't like my principles, I've got others. These guys have taken a lot of my facts. Let me try and choose some others, okay? But all relevant, eh? There's a time, we are here to talk about the left response to anti-Semitism. How do we respond to these accusations? There was a time that some of the Zionist movement presented itself as being part of the left. If you look at the early histories, they entered some of the Second International discussions, etc., etc., and it may have led may have been some of the influencing points that pushed the Soviet Union then to recognize the state of Israel when it was formally recognized as a state in 1948. Now, I just mentioned that often that history of the kibbutzim and others ignored the fact that this was done at the expense of Palestinian lives, their stories, their histories. So they were uprooted, they were annihilated, and their history was expunged and continues to be expunged in the story as we will tell it further. Now, Haider challenged us not to be too defensive. He talks about learning from South Africa and also drew references to apartheid and Nazism. And he quoted, as he said in his earlier presentations into the British Parliament, Israeli generals who have used these analogies. He spoke about the various wars on Gaza. I'll come back to some of that in relation to making some comment. Andrew rightfully mentioned how big supporters of Israel, those who stormed the Capitol in January 2020 of Washington, love Israel but hate Jews. You have this weird situation among many of those groups where they love Israeli power, the state power, but Jewish people, which is the true manifestation of anti-Semitism, are not loved, not even tolerated. And what this project represents, as Andrew points out, is that Palestinians are disposable, they are the ones, as I will hopefully touch on, who are experimented upon, right, at the service of hegemonic power, right? Andrew speaks about the hierarchy of sufferings, of racism, right? In our country here, black lesbians have been killed. Working class poor people around farming areas have been killed by white farmers, by the police, right? And yet there is an upsurge in the discourse around around anti-Semitism here. There's a weaponization, as Andrew speaks about, of anti-Semitism worldwide. Andrew also spoke about the Nazi experiences. But they both challenge us to bring up an offensive strategy. And I want to ask, what does this look like for us? I will spend some time looking at the South African Jewish report, sometimes my favorite bedtime reading these days. As I've said, campaigns around anti-Semitism are very, very high. But this is in contrast to the actual cases of anti-Semitism on the ground in South Africa. Now, if you think I'm saying this because I'm an activist, I want to quote the South African Jewish report, who in January 2020, a year ago, published an article entitled Anti-Semitic Incidents in South Africa at a 15-year low by Nicola Miltz, right? And they tried to explore the reasons why this is so. Now, David Sachs is one of the other sparring partners that we have here, reminds us that we need to distinguish between anti-Semitic acts, that is doing bad things to Jews, and the anti-Semitic discourse. South Africa has been very low rates in the first category, but not in the second, which is probably impossible to measure accurately in any case. But what happens? There's an attempt to make some kind of scientific investigation into that. The truth that cannot be denied, that the campaigning on anti-Semitism is very, very high. Any Tom, Dick, and Harry, or BDS and such, and their friends, or Chikane, or Achille Mbembe can be accused of being anti-Semitic. One of the activists, Zane Dango, they attacked him once, and they used the duck test. They say, well, you know, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and sounds like, that is it, that's anti-Semitic. So it's a kind of definition that is quite malleable. You can move it around. And it's clear that it is weaponized. It is a big stick to bludgeon the opponents into submission so that we can be afraid. And they use the legitimate claims for sympathy and solidarity with those who've been killed in the Holocaust. They use it in a way that rubbishes the integrity of it because they use it for political ends. They use it to bludgeon people into submission and to close down the space for debate, discussion, and democracy in many countries. Ironically, these supporters of Israel and Israel, they do not fail in reminding us they're the only democracy in the world, or in that part of the world, rather. So there have already been discussions about the resolution from the International Holocaust. I won't go through that, but let me just touch a little bit on about what has happened before, about this democracy that has been, the space that has been closed up. I think in 2006, Ronnie Kestrels, one of our leaders here, was challenged by the then editor of the South African Jewish Report when they asked Ronnie a number of questions, because he was a pro-Palestinian Jewish minister, communist, in government. So they asked him a number of questions that they challenged him to answer. When he answered it, they refused to publish it on the grounds that his reply, because it referred to the actions that were fascistic, that were akin to some of the Nazi ways of doing things. They said some of those statements were so offensive to the sensibilities of the majority of readers that they would not contribute to constructive debate, but would simply give deep offense. So they didn't run his reply. This is democracy, right? So it is not a new thing, but it has picked up increased vigor. So much so in 2019, Gideon Levy writes, the plague is spreading. Under the cover of a just war against anti-Semitism, Europe and the United States silence every voice daring to criticize Israel. Under cover of this war, they are undermining their freedom of speech. Now, you've already heard about Levy, works for Haaretz. Him and Amira Mas do incredibly good work exposing from inside the atrocities against Palestinians. But what Gideon's quote shows us is that the Israeli supporters, most of them Jewish and Zionist, also most of them Christian evangelicals in the United States and even in this country, right? They have removed their support for the poor and the oppressed. They are working quite consciously with elites in government and corporations, right? So Levy, while he was talking about how these guys were trying to close down the space by outlawing the BDS in the parliaments, the French parliament, in Berlin, elsewhere. And thankfully, a number of activists have fought back and turned these around because they were against the rights to free speech, organization, to move around and to live a democratic life. But the question we must ask, why is this happening? The writer Jeff Harper says that Israel is a laboratory of repression and control, useful for dictators and the wealthy. They use it there because they could easily, as he argues, get rid of the occupation, and Israel could become like an island where no one really goes to, or something like New Zealand, quite peaceful on its own. No, but they serve a purpose. They are a laboratory where they can say, we have killed. They don't use those words. They put it. They can say something. They've done it in battle tested, guns that can shoot around the walls, etc., etc. They've tested this on people. So the kind of battle that we are having around ideas is replicated on the ground, where people's homes are demolished, people have been removed day by day, their land continuously taken, ethnic cleansing continues unabated. The Israeli state does not have one strategy. It's not just the propaganda one. But there are also some of our comrades who are contesting the battle for ideas. What I want to say, and I think following from the other speakers, that Marx has said, it's not good enough just to interpret the world. We have to engage in the battle to change it, right? And hopefully not as the Zionists have changed it, but we should change it as left people with compassion, bringing in those who are marginalized. And as long as we stay on the side of the oppressed and the poorest, we will be on the right track. So let me talk a little bit about our challenge. That in an article published on 22nd October last year, the BDS was labeled as anti-Semitic. And part of the simple tactic they used was they said, here's a cartoon that is anti-Semitic. You have reproduced it on your Facebook page. Because of that, you are anti-Semitic. The cartoon was produced by the GIUSA, a trade union, General Industries Workers Union of South Africa. And its president called me to say, hey, Comrade Hassan, did you see this cartoon where these guys are accusing us of being anti-Semitic? He didn't refer me to the union's website. He didn't refer me to the BDS website, which has only recently been relaunched, by the way. He referred me to the South African Jewish Report newspaper. I asked, and I asked consistently, if this was so anti-Semitic, why is it that you continuously reproduce it? If you want to see it now, you go onto the website, you'll find it. It's clear that they're not offended by this cartoon. But the comments that they made was, and the BDS had to call them out on this, to say, you see a boss there with money around him and workers who are starving. Automatically you start assuming that that boss is Jewish. You are making an anti-Semitic assumption. We are not. We're saying that's a worker and that's a boss, and they should fight this out for a living wage, which is supported by us. And as you've heard from the introduction, the appellate division of this Ombuds office, Judge Bernard Mwepe, ruled basically, that they had no case, they were splitting at hairs, and they were not doing something. But what is important in our fight back? We need to know that a lot of the attacks on South African intellectuals, both the priest and the Achille Mbembe adverts, comes from Germany. The guilt in Germany represents one thing, and the progressive laws in Germany provide for that. But Germany has taken it upon itself to label any action critical of the state of Israel as being anti-Semitic. And that is something that we need to do. And I think that the legacy, their role in the horrendous killing of 6 million Jews it's not only a blot on them, it's a blot on all humanity. But for some reason, they cannot see other suffering. And they simply will go with the official voice that is out there. And so clearly, what we have done then is that we need to challenge them as we've done. Tomorrow morning, the BDS will be writing a letter to South African Jewish Report to say, get our name right. They were talking about Mogoeng, the Chief Justice case here, and they called the South African BDS coalition BDS South Africa. Now, clearly, this level of vigilance on them augurs well for the future, but I think we must be clear. There are legions, big armies of people working for the Hasbara, working for Israeli propaganda. Unpaid, they are soldiers, they are volunteers, various Jewish boards of deputies, Zionist federations, groups of people who are working day and night to undermine, not only to defend the state of Israel, but to undermine Palestinians, because that's the only way they can defend the state of Israel. So what we need to do is to get more professional. We have to have more people on paid work, working for justice here. Using the example of the anti-apartheid movement, and I think, Andrew, you in London there, you obviously will know of Collins, and then they started and the family of ours, Paul Joseph and others, were active in the International Defense and Aid Fund. There must be such funds that the BDS and others must set up, which will support groups who are being harassed, vilified, brutalized on various campuses in the USA, various other places, for daring to speak truth to power. There must be support for them. But as we do this, as we coordinate, we must make sure we don't stifle people. We must coordinate, not subjugate people's initiatives. We in the left, we stand for universal values, not narrow values of particularist interests for some groups. You can't have a state for Jewish people only. You can't have that. And when you say that, they're going to say you're anti-Semitic, because these are part of the definitions that are now doing the rounds. We need to try and stay close to the poor and the oppressed generally. So what I'm saying in conclusion, Chair, we can do better, right? A few years ago, Electronic Intifada exposed the work of Camera. These are the people who spoke about Reverend Chikane, right? They spoke about how pro-Israeli pressure groups are orchestrating secret campaigns to infiltrate the online encyclopedia, Wikipedia, to rewrite Palestinian history. Now, let me give you 2 examples in my conclusion. If you do a simple search on Israeli Apartheid Week, right? This is about us, our Israeli Apartheid Week. They'll start off, and they've been advised how to do it by insiders. They say, well, Israeli Apartheid Week, which we're now having, was started as this annual series of university lectures, etc., etc. The end of that first paragraph says, IAW Week has garnered such controversy since its inception and has been criticized by some as anti-Semitic. Then they say, citation needed. They just put it there. They look for the citation, right? The criticism of this section is even longer than the article as a whole. All the kind of Zionist attacks on us comes into that article, which purports to be about our activity. This is an area that we cannot leave to them. We must contest today, tomorrow, every day. The Gaza article I want to refer you to, which is about the war on Gaza, starts off with the 2014 Gaza war, also known as Operation Protective Edge. Hebrew, they give the name there, etc., etc. And it says, the combined Israeli airstrikes, ground and bombardment, and Palestinian rocket attacks resulted in thousands of deaths. The vast majority of them Gazans. Put down, Gazans. Now, clearly, really, You don't have to be a rocket scientist. You simply look at the UN, what its investigations found, and you'll find 2,251 Palestinians, including 1,462 civilians, were killed. Of the Palestinian fatalities, 551 were children and 299 were women. Clearly, it is so easy to put that in, and it's not done. Let me end there.
Thanks, Hassan. It's just after 10 past, so I think we do have a good amount of time for discussion. I think, Hassan, thank you. You've raised, sort of practical and real examples of how we can exactly not be on the defensive, as Haida mentioned. And I think that's, that kind of coming up with a strategy to ensure that we aren't defensive and responding all the time, but that we're actually proactively taking the message out there is hugely important. I think just to look at the chat, the Q&A, I think everyone can see the questions that are asked there. There's one on how can Donald Trump be considered anti-Semitic if he's willing to support Israel in moving its capital to Jerusalem and in setting up the American embassy there, and also having his own daughter marry Jared Kushner. There's another one from Firoza around many Christians support Israel from a biblical perspective. They do not see the impact of Zionism and occupation. This can be seen from the support Mogoeng, our Chief Justice, is getting. They see any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. How can we have a constructive discussion with people who hold this view? There's another one, the first one around a campaign equating anti-Semitism with racism. Well, I think that's exactly what we are doing, what the BNC does. And I think, obviously that we need to continue that. I also think some of the themes that have come up around the media, Haida mentioned the way in which the BBC didn't ask him for comments, wouldn't refer to the statement that Palestinians had made, clarifying a lot of the issues that they were being accused of, or he was implicated in with Corbyn. And generally around the media, Hassan's mentioned Wikipedia, which I suppose is something that we can all contribute to. But the way in which the narrative is spun is a big issue, and particularly I know in Britain with the BBC, in particular the state broadcaster. Again, yes, we've got the issue of Corbyn's apologising and how we might have dealt with that differently. Yeah, I think those are the main things that have come up. I'm just trying to put it all together so that Andrew can have a chance to really get his teeth into a response before he has to leave. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much. And if I could just say thank you to the other two panelists whose contributions I think were so important and raised so many crucial issues, some of which I'm going to try and touch on if I may. Excellent questions. I think the question about Donald Trump is an incredibly important one. So clearly, anti-Semitism is not necessarily about one's diplomatic approach as a political leader to Israel. And we should remind ourselves of what anti-Semitism is. It's about affixing certain negative characteristics to a group of people due to an aspect of their identity. In this instance, it's ethnicity, religion, race, however you want to define it, and that is a whole discourse on its own. But in the case of Donald Trump, it's actually very interesting. Now, I have no idea whether Donald Trump is personally anti-Semitic or not. What I do know is that before he became president, a number of people who had significant contact with him reported when he then ran for the presidency about what were obviously anti-Semitic comments that he'd made. And he used to make them particularly in relation to people he was competing with in business or who he would allow to look after his money and he would not. you know, he would say some incredibly disparaging things about people, identifying them as Jewish, and their extraordinary affinity with money. Now, this is an obvious anti-Semitic trope that has been used for thousands of years, but perhaps more importantly is that throughout his political career, brief and destructive as it was, or hopefully was, there are numerous examples of Trump using what were effectively Nazi symbols to negatively identify groups of people. So, you know, in this most recent campaign, the campaign ran ads on Facebook before Facebook was forced to take them down, in which they had pictures of symbols of red triangles together with words about what should be done to the anti-fascist movement. Now, the reality is that the Nazis used the symbol of a red triangle that had to be sewn onto the coat of somebody who had been identified by the Nazis as a socialist or a communist. And many of those people landed up in concentration camps and landed up being killed. The image of Hillary Clinton, whatever one might or might not think of Hillary Clinton, and I'm not a fan, but that's irrelevant here. The image he used of Hillary Clinton next to a pile of money and a Star of David, sinister images of bankers, of George Soros, which is how Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, has won each of his election campaigns. Now, the irony of Orban's situation is that he initially won power on a very strong anti-communist platform. Post the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Iron Curtain, he positioned himself as opposed to anything that had to do with the Cold War regime in Hungary. That started wearing off fairly quickly. So come his second election, he actually hired political consultants who, by the way, happened to be Jewish New Yorkers. And they said to him, you need to find a new enemy. The communists aren't working as an enemy. It's becoming too distant a memory for some people. And it was they who identified George Soros. And there were these repulsive campaign posters all over Hungary of this caricaturish image of Soros, who is Hungarian and who is very easily identifiable in Hungary. But the nose was sort of accentuated. And he was regarded as one of these people who controls the world and is controlling Hungary. And I mean, that is the basis on which Viktor Orban has maintained political power. But he is regarded as close an ally of the Israeli state as Donald Trump was as president. So I think this is part of the dissonance that we're talking about at the moment, that I referred to when I spoke about those people occupying the Capitol who had anti-Semitic slogans on their T-shirts, but were holding up the Israeli flag. So Israel has come to represent certain things to certain political groupings, and one of the questions talks about many evangelical Christians in particular who support Israel, perhaps from a biblical perspective or others. The final example of that I want to give is that of Boris Johnson, the clown of a British prime minister, who not only described all Africans as dark people with watermelon smiles. I mean, he has a history throughout his professional and political career of racism, but he wrote a novel that was just chock full of anti-Semitic tropes. Now, this is the man who is prime minister who Jeremy Corbyn is contesting an election against. Did any of the Jewish groups ever point out Boris Johnson's use of anti-Semitic tropes, etc.? But that in no way affects Johnson's support for Israel, because that is a different type of political calculation and calibration. So I think it's important to distinguish those things. And that brings me to the question of the response to claims of anti-Semitism from Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. I think there were a number of mistakes made in that response. I think that the way in which the party responded to the Jewish Board of Deputies as though it represented all British Jews was a massive miscalculation. The Board of Deputies in Britain represents or has deputies elected from 40% of synagogues in the United Kingdom. So you could argue that it may represent 40% of British Jews. I don't know whether all people in those particular synagogues all believe or feel they're represented by the British Board of Deputies. But that leaves a very sizable part of the British Jewish community who either don't go to synagogue at all, who are ultra-Orthodox, and interestingly, there are a number of ultra-Orthodox Jewish groups, both inside and outside Israel, who are anti-Zionist. I think that what the party did not acknowledge significantly enough is that the British Board of Deputies happens to be a very politically conservative group that is very closely linked to the Israeli state by its own constitution and definition. So the president of the British Board of Deputies during the last election actually put up photos of herself holding placards saying things like, "No to socialism," and "We will never accept socialism." Now, this is because obviously the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn in this election campaign were associated with socialism. But that's taking a political stance. And I think that the Labour Party could have been far more forceful in addressing some of these political realities. I also think that the Labour Party's disciplinary processes should have been far better in identifying where people were being accused of anti-Semitism for inappropriate reasons, where the accusations were clearly baseless. And I think that has come back to haunt Jeremy himself personally. For instance, they never raised the fact that the only polling done, and there is very little polling done on these sorts of things, but there were two polls conducted in 2015 and 2017 by the same polling organization. In 2015, when Labour had a Jewish leader called Ed Miliband, this poll found that supporters of the Labour Party were the second least likely to hold anti-Semitic views of all active political people who identified themselves with the party in the UK. The Liberal Democrat supporters were slightly lower than the Labour Party, but the Tory voters, the UKIP supporters, etc., were all far more anti-Semitic than Labour supporters. In 2017, after 2 years of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, Labour was now joint last with the Liberal Democrats. In other words, its supporters were least likely to exhibit anti-Semitic views after 2 years of Jeremy's leadership. And bizarrely, all of these people who raised these issues of anti-Semitism against Jeremy Corbyn had never done so previously in his 33 years of public life. They had criticized his support of his criticisms of Israel and his support of Palestinians, but had never suggested that he was anti-Semitic. This was something that was used as a political tactic at a particular time and point, where he came within less than 3,000 votes of being elected Prime Minister of Great Britain, when he became a real threat to the broad establishment in the United Kingdom. Let me repeat what I think is obvious, or I hope is obvious, to every single person on this call. One incident of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia, of anti-Black racism, of any form of racism and discrimination is one incident too many. But we have to accept that there is no hierarchy of discrimination or racism. And it is my view that as activists, as campaigners, coming from the backgrounds we do, it is our responsibility to be forceful in the promotion of our anti-racism. Very quickly, if I may, there is also a question about whether criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism or cannot be anti-Semitic. Of course, certain types of criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitic. If somebody says, for instance, all Jews support Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, all Jews are opposed to the creation of a Palestinian state, all Jews are opposed to the liberation of the Palestinian people, all Jews support the occupation of Palestine, that is anti-Semitic, because not all Jews do. And you are simply taking the fact that they are Jewish, eliding into the fact that they are supportive of Israel. It's like when I gave my maiden speech in Parliament, which was on the remarkably boring topic of the post office budget bill. Some members of the National Party, which was still in existence then, started shouting at me, "Yo communists, yo communists!" Because I was a white Jew who was a member of the ANC, I therefore had to be a member of the South African Communist Party and myself a communist. I didn't mind being called a communist, but it was that reductionism of theirs that was so offensive to some people in the Houses of Parliament. And in fact, Jill Marcus stood up. I think she was Deputy Minister of Finance at the time, and demanded that those members of the National Party be ejected from the House, which they were. But to criticize Israel is not equivalent to anti-Semitism. You simply cannot say that that extremely important minority of Israeli Jews who are highly critical of the state of Israel and sacrifice an enormous amount to oppose the occupation of Palestine and to wage political struggle against certain aspects of the state of Israel. You cannot call those people anti-Semitic. You cannot call ultra-Orthodox Israelis who are opposed to Zionism and therefore the existence of the state of Israel, you cannot describe them as anti-Semitic. Not if anti-Semitism is to have any meaning in the world whatsoever. But let me finally say, and please, I must apologize for the fact that I have to leave early. The British government late last night announced that they're increasing Britain's nuclear warheads by 40%. By 40%. So there is an urgent rally that is taking place as we speak that I've just been asked to speak at before it ends. But let me say as my final word, and in thanking again the organizers and my fellow panelists and all of you for attending and participating in this, let me say that as a Jew whose family suffered in the Holocaust, as a South African who was privileged by the color of my skin in South Africa, but who witnessed the suffering of the vast majority of South Africans under apartheid, and still today under the consequences of apartheid economically and in a variety of other ways. I believe that I have a responsibility to speak out against injustice, oppression, and discrimination and racism wherever it raises its head. And one of the places it raises its head today, in a brutal and indefensible manner, is in Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. And I believe that it is my responsibility to my ancestors, it is my responsibility as a South African citizen, which I still am, to speak out against the Israeli occupation, to speak out when false claims of racism or anti-Semitism are used to try and stop me and anybody else from pointing out and rejecting those abuses. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope that the rest of your conversation goes well.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and good luck with the anti-nuclear meeting that you're attending. It sounds like a horrendous situation. But moving swiftly on, it's now 8:30, so maybe we can just ask Hassan also to, taking in mind the questions that were asked and anything else that he wants to add to for a few minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Roshan. Thank you, Andrew, and stop the war. The author, one of the co-authors of the working definition of anti-Semitism, his name was Kenneth Stern. He wrote a year ago that, and he's a Jewish guy, right? He says, it's in The Guardian, I drafted the definition of anti-Semitism. Right-wing Jews are weaponizing it. So he's not a guy who loves the struggles the way we would do, and he's not in our same trenches. But he talks about how Donald Trump, in his executive order, just before he was out, actually was weaponizing a number of groups to use anti-Semitism to close down speech. Let me just quote this. He says, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and special advisor, wrote in the New York Times that the definition makes clear that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Then he goes on to say that he was not such a proponent. He did not want it to close down speech. And he even says anti-Semitism is a real issue, but too often people, both on the political right and political left, give it a pass if a person has the right view of Israel. Historically, anti-Semitism thrives best when leaders stroke the human capacity to define us and them, and where integrity of the democratic institution and norms are under assault. So basically, he's arguing elsewhere here that on campuses and that people can be, as if they are permitted, asking for permission, can be anti-Zionist, and it shouldn't be closed down. So clearly, as we asking for more coordinated, sustained effort in defense of freedoms, we must note that every day there's a new one being attacked, a new grouping, a new person, and we need to work twice as hard, maybe many times more as hard. 5 days ago, South African Jewish Report published an article attacking the National Health Union for saying that in Israel there was medical apartheid. The comedian in the States who said Israel has done so well, it is vaccinated half of its population. He says, let me hasten to guess, the Jewish half. In America, he was forced to withdraw that joke. Now, we have a chance here to make sure that we are anti-racist in its essence, which means that we are anti-Semitic. We're anti the attacks and slurs against Muslims. We're anti-attacks on Jewish. We're anti-attacks against lesbian women. We're against the attacks against anyone who does not look like us. Xenophobia, those who come from across the border. So clearly, there's a lot of work to be done. And those who fight for justice, fight for Palestine. We fight against xenophobia. We fight against anti-African hate, So really, we are not just fighting for justice for Palestinians. We are involved. If you look at many of us here, we do more than just fighting for this. So when we have the attack by Jewish groups that, Israel is being singled out. Israel is not being singled out. when we try to treat it like any other African nation by putting it in front of the ICC, they say, no, treat us differently. You know, so clearly they can't have it both ways. And we, so Roshan, that's basically what I want to say for today.
Thanks very much, Hassan. And in absence now, both Haider and Andrew, I think it's been a fantastic discussion with excellent panelists. And I think we've started exactly to take the offensive on this issue and to say we won't be silenced. We will speak up and stand up in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And we will not allow weaponization of anti-Semitism to derail us, to silence us on the question of Palestine. And as Hassan has said, as anti-racists and as people who work in various ways with the oppressed in South Africa and around the world, we will just simply not allow our voices to be silenced and to be used for the state of Israel to make its gains along with political elites, as has been outlined clearly by Andrew in particular, the link between Trump, between Orban, anti-Semites with the state of Israel. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to PSC Cape Town for organizing this. And I'm sure this is just the beginning. We'll be putting the recordings and the full recording of Haider's contribution on our YouTube and also on our very new website. It's so new, I can't actually tell you the website address, so you'll have to keep following us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you. I thought that was a way to get them to keep following us on our social media. And we look forward to you joining us again for the rest of the program, particularly on Friday evening. We have a premiere film showing of a really fantastic film called The Mayor, on Friday evening. So check on our social media, and it is definitely up on our website to register for that. And Viva Palestine, Amandla. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you. SABD School Vision.
Palestine represents